Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a book haul revisit. If you are unfamiliar, this is something I do every month where I look back at previous book hauls from this month and see how many of the books I have read, how many I would still like to read, how many I have potentially unhauled, and start to think about whether or not I need to unhaul any of the books that I still have. I will have links to the original book haul videos down below. I won't be spending a whole lot of time talking about what each of these books, and there are a fair amount of them, are about. So if you want information about the book, I would direct you to those original book haul videos. You'll get information about the book and all of that stuff. And then just one more footnote before we get started. In these, in order to make it a little bit more manageable, because we have like 4 years of book hauls to look at, I am not including Sue Grafton books because I purchased those to rebuild my collection. It's not the same as purchasing a book with the intention of reading it for the first time. And actually, you can see my Sue Graftons right there on my bookshelf. I am also not including anything from my Pulitzer Prize project. I'm not including anything that I had read before I purchased it, because if that's the case, I purchased it because I knew I liked it and wanted a copy on my shelf. And again, it's not the same thing as purchasing a book with the intention of maybe getting around to it. And the same goes for my Pulitzer Prize project. It's something that is a little bit different. And that's pretty much all of the footnotes. We are going to start with the most recent book haul, which is obviously December of 2022. And we're going to work our way back in time to December of 2019. Let's get going. The first book I brought into my library in December of 2022 was The Sleeping Car Porter by Suzette Mayer. This is something I was hearing a lot of really good things about last year. I think it won the Giller Prize, could be, and I purchased a copy because it wasn't available at my library or anywhere else. And here we are a year later, and I still have not managed to read it. However, I would still like to read this book, so it is ultimately not going to go anywhere. I have thought about reading this on audio over the last year, but I still think this is a book that I would like to read in print. So it's not going to go anywhere. It's totally fine sitting here. And I think because I've heard that this book has a very dreamlike quality, I'm kind of thinking that print would be a little bit better for me than trying to do this on audio. So it's not going anywhere. I still want to read it. And, in the meantime, it'll be happy to sit on my shelf. In June, I always do Pride book reading. I try to read books that center queer stories and queer authors and things like that. So this is kind of like a natural to be on my Pride Month pile of possibilities next year. If I haven't read it by then, we'll see how that goes. But even if I don't end up reading it in 2024, I'm pretty sure I'll be totally fine having this book stick around in perpetuity. Next, we have a graphic novel. It's graphic nonfiction, actually. Flying Out of Space, inspired by the indecent adventures of Patricia Highsmith by Grace Ellis and Hannah Templer. Here is a success story. I have read this, and I liked it fine. I think it falls into a bit of a trap that graphic novels, graphic memoirs, graphic nonfiction sometimes can, where it feels like they're unwilling to fill out the page count too much. I felt like I wanted a little bit more detail. It feels like it's a little bit surface level. It kind of glosses over some of the things. It definitely lets you know that Patricia Highsmith had some very problematic behaviors. She could be anti-Semitic, but it doesn't really grapple with those things. And although it deals with her perspective as someone who was part of the queer community and trying to break out as a writer, again, you're left wondering, well, how am I supposed to feel about any of this? So I liked it. And I would recommend it, but I do wish there had been at least a little bit more in that book, if that makes any sense. That takes us to The Stone Angel by Margaret Lawrence, who is, I believe, a celebrated Canadian author. I have still not read this book, but this to me was something of a library builder. I did not have immediate plans to read this book. I just wanted to get a copy because they talked about it in an episode of the New York Times Book Review podcast, and it sounded really interesting. And then I believe I reached out to Sean the Book Maniac, who of course is Canadian, and he gave an endorsement to Margaret Lawrence. So here it is. And again, I did not have immediate plans to get to this, so I'm not at all surprised that a year later I have not read it yet. And I still don't have immediate plans to read this book. But I'm totally fine holding on to it. Library builders to me are almost like aspirational book purchasing. Hopefully when you see them on your shelf, you'll think, "Oh, I want to read that," and maybe pick it up. Because I am something of a mood reader. That hasn't really happened, to be honest, since I have been on BookTube. Because even though I'm a mood reader, I have like lists of things I feel like I need to get to since I joined BookTube. So maybe if I can get back to the type of person who would just peruse his shelf and pick a book, maybe I should do that in 2024. And maybe Stone Angel by Margaret Lawrence would benefit. But yeah, in the meantime, I am totally fine holding on to it because someday I would like to read it. Now, there are 3 books I don't have anymore. A Man Lay Dead by Nao Marsh, Enter a Murderer by Nao Marsh, and The Nursing Home Murder by Nao Marsh. I don't know if you're sensing a theme. They are the first 3 books in Nao Marsh's series of mystery novels, classic mystery novels. I believe they were published in the 1930s, possibly the 1920s. And I read all of them, and I decided that this wasn't a series I felt like I needed to keep the books. I don't think this is going to be like a Sue Grafton scenario where I'm going to have a whole collection of Nao Marsh books by the end, because I thought they were pretty uneven. So I just didn't feel any need to hold on to them. I do have more Nao Marsh books that I purchased in a different month, so we'll deal with them in a different book haul revisit at some point in the future. They're on my shelf. I have the next one in the series, and I think a later one in the series. And we'll see how things go. I might just get them from the library. I'll probably continue in the series. So I read these, and that's at least successful. I just didn't really feel like I needed to keep them, especially since my mystery thriller section is pretty small and does not have a whole lot of room. So didn't feel like saving a lot of that room for a series that I didn't quite enjoy, certainly not at the level of Sue Grafton, which is probably my favorite mystery series. Then the last book from December of 2022 is 7 Houses, a Memoir of Time and Places by Josephine W. Johnson. If you follow along, you know the story behind this. Basically, I'm doing a Pulitzer Prize project, and I kind of mentioned that earlier because I had mentioned purchasing books for my project, but I wanted to read every book that has won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Josephine Johnson won the Pulitzer Prize in 1935, somewhere thereabout, for a book called Now in November, and I really loved that book, and I wanted to know more about Josephine Johnson, and this is described as her memoir. It's told through places that she lived. So I was kind of hoping that it would have more information, because basically the mystery of Josephine Johnson, and I have a whole video about this, I'll link it down below, is why she stopped writing for such a long time. And I was hoping there would be information in here about that, and ultimately there wasn't. However, it was still a fascinating book, and I'm very happy to have it, and I will keep it. I have another Josephine Johnson book on my nonfiction shelf, which is over there, and she's an author that I really like. So I read it, and I thought this was just okay, but I'm perfectly fine keeping it. 7 Houses, A Memoir of Time and Places by Josephine Johnson. I would actually recommend Inland Island much more. It's a nonfiction book about every chapter is a month on her property that she shares with her husband, and it actually has more information about why she left publishing than 7 Houses. However, it still doesn't have a whole lot. But I would recommend that one over 7 Houses, just if you're interested. But this was a good book, and I'm still very interested in Josephine Johnson. So there were 7 books that I brought into my library in the month of December 2022, and already I can see that my math is wrong because no, it's not wrong. Good for me, I did it right. So there were 5 books that I read out of this, and there are 3 that I unhauled, and all 3 were the Nao Marsh books, which we talked about at length. So let's just move on to December of 2021. The first book that I brought into my library then was Fairyland, A Memoir of My Father by Alicia Abbott. This is still something I want to read, something I'm still looking forward to. It does seem like something I would probably listen to on audio. However, at the time, and I would have to go back and look now because it's been 2 years, at the time, there really wasn't an audio readily available. And now I'm on Libro, so I could always cash in a credit if there is one. And I don't know if anything has changed. There has been a movie version of this released. I don't know if it's even widely available, because I heard that it was going to be released, and then I heard nothing about it ever since. So clearly it didn't do very well. But point remains, this is a book that I am still waiting to read and would still like to read and would still be interested in reading. I tend to do nonfiction on audio, which is why I've been kind of focusing on that. However, I am happy keeping this book in my collection to wait and see if I end up reading it in print or if I do it on audio. It just sounds like a really interesting book to me. So it's totally fine staying and hanging out in my collection. Then we have Guapa by Salim Haddad, which I believe had been recommended by Jen the librarian. And I still haven't gotten around to reading it. However, I keep seeing people mentioning this book. I saw somebody mention it, and I don't remember who. I think it was on Threads, mentioning Guapa by Salim Haddad and how great it is. So clearly I need to get around to this. And again, I always do Pride Month reading, so this is kind of a natural fit to be on that pile of possibilities come June of 2024, if I haven't gotten around to it yet. So the same is true of Fairyland, by the way. So, that's not a guarantee that I would read it in June. However, it is a sign that it is still a book that is very much in the mix to be read. And I'm still very much looking forward to reading Guapa by Salim Haddad. Which takes us to another book that Jen the librarian had mentioned, The Intoxicating Mr. Lavelle by Neil Blackmore. I have not gotten around to reading this one either. I feel like I haven't gotten around to reading most of these books, which is not great. Actually, there were 5 out of 7 in the last book haul. So let me stop being self-deprecating and give myself a little bit of credit. Although, this one is not going great so far. Oh, well. I still want to read it. It seems like it's not an easy book from what I've heard, but it does seem like something that would be kind of easy to fit in. And it just sounded interesting and entertaining, so it's going to stay on my shelf. It has this bold cover that kind of stands out, and I see it on my bookshelf a fair amount and think to myself, oh, I need to read that. So I guess PSA to people who design books, this is a really helpful thing because it's very identifiable when I look at the bookshelf, and it will make me think, ooh, I need to read that book. So I still want to read it, have not yet. That takes us to Oh Beautiful, a novel by Jung Yoon. I have not gotten around to reading this, and actually the audio is now available on Scribd. I happened to see it over the last few months. So we'll see if I finally get around to reading the book in print or if I get around to listening to it on audio. I will say, and this is not an uncommon thing, the urgency has died a little bit as I've gotten further away from when this book was brought into my library. However, it is something I would still like to read. This is not a book that has been referenced. Like Guapa keeps coming up. This is not that. However, I have heard good things about it. It was recommended to me by someone whose opinion on books I trust. And it's a actually beautiful book cover as well. So I'm going to keep it. I would still like to read it, and there are no reasons it would be going anywhere anytime soon. And we'll see if I ultimately get to it in print or on audio, because that is an option that is available to me now at this point. I fully admit I have considered unhauling this book because of the likelihood that I would listen to it on audio rather than the print book. It's Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America by Mayuk Sen. It still sounds really interesting, and that's ultimately the reason why I kept the book. I still want to read it, and I'm a little worried that if I get rid of the book and just add it to my saved list on, say, Scribd or any one of my audio apps, that there won't be this immediate physical reminder that this is something that I would be interested in reading, because this is obviously about 7 immigrant women who revolutionized food in America. I mean, go figure. It's right what it says on the cover. And that is something that I would find very interesting. So even though this is not a book I hear a lot about, it's not something people keep talking about, again, like Guapa, it is something that I would like to read. So since I'm not dying for room in my nonfiction section, I figure I'll hold on to this and maybe it will spur the energy to read this, because I feel like I tend to lose books that end up in my saved list on audio apps. Whereas if I can see it on my shelf, it's a much better reminder about a book that I might want to read at some point if I am in the proper mood or don't have anything lined up or anything like that. And that is sort of the challenge for that. So I am going to hold on to it and we'll see what happens with that. The final book that I purchased in December of 2021 was The 1619 Project by Nicole Hannah Jones. And I really purchased this because at the time, someone who was a conservative politician had actually made an effort to try to get people to buy his book in order to knock this off of the New York Times bestseller list. Obviously, it did not work because, for one thing, it's a weird flex to try to do. For another, really, he just inspired people, including myself, to actually go out and purchase copies of the 1619 Project, which I have not read. This is definitely something that I would do on audio. And I know that, and I knew that when I purchased it, but I'm fine holding on to it because I wanted to support Nicole Hannah-Jones. Montana Book Company had a signed copy at the time, so I got one of those. Let's show off the signature, shall we? Because that's always kind of interesting to see. So I knew at the time that I wanted to listen to this on audio, and I know now that if I were going to read the 1619 Project, it would be on audio. However, it's totally fine staying on my shelf because I like the project. I like what it means. I like the work that Nicole Hannah-Jones has done, and I would like to read it at some point. So it is totally fine staying on my shelf, even though I haven't read it, and I know that I would read it on audio. So December of 2021, I brought, again, 7 books into my library. This is where, and I missed one, actually. Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford. I unhauled that. It popped up on a couple of year-end best lists, and then I was still a member of Book of the Month, and it was in the mix for that, so I cashed in a credit and got it here. And then ultimately, I just admitted to myself, what is the likelihood I'm going to read this? And ultimately, if I do read it, it's going to be on audio. So it didn't survive a cut. There was a point last year where I really didn't have space and I had to make some tough calls in my library, and it was a victim of that. So back to the results. 7 books were brought into my library in December of 2021, and I haven't read any. So that is really not good. I did okay with last year's book haul, but this one, not so much. However, again, there are a lot of books here that maybe I would do on audio, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, but there are books here that I would really be interested in reading, pretty much all of them, actually. So even though I haven't read them yet, it's not a total loss, and I have only unhauled one of them. That was Somebody's Daughter by Ashley C. Ford, and even that one I would listen to on audio. It's just that I had to make a tough call about what to do with my library before we did this expansion that you see behind me. Let's go to December of 2020. The first book is an unhaul, but I did read it first. It's The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. I had really high hopes for that book, and I just didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much as I thought I would. So I didn't see any point in trying to keep it in my library. So it's not here anymore. It is what it is. Then we have Lolly Willows by Sylvia Townsend Warner. This is a book that actually keeps popping up, and I've seen people read it and enjoy it, and it is something I would still like to read. So even though I don't have immediate plans to read it, and I don't know when I would, to me this is, again, a library builder. It's something that I am hoping that having it in my library will help me get to at some point. We'll see how that goes. And again, the fact that people keep mentioning this book does help keep it fairly high on my list of, I don't want to say priorities, because I don't really have a priority attached to this book. That's kind of the nature of the library builder thing. But it keeps it top of mind. And again, top of mind is a bit of an exaggeration because it's not top. But it keeps it in my mind and keeps reminding me that I have this book and I would like to read it because it is something that sounds interesting and that other people read a surprising amount. But yeah, so it's something that I'm going to hold on to and hopefully we'll be getting to at some point. Then we have The Moor's Account by Layla Lalami. Now, this was another one that I seriously considered unhauling because I did not have immediate plans. Again, at that time when I was having that really massive crunch for space in my library, ultimately I did hold on to it. And now that I have the space, it's totally fine hanging out because this was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. That's the thing that immediately drew it to my attention back when I brought it into my library. So at some point I will do a Pulitzer Prize project about that year, and I don't remember what year it was. Copyright 2014. I don't remember what won that year. But point is, at some point, this will be attached to something I do for my Pulitzer Prize project. It's not a winner, but it was a finalist. So there's a bit of interest there attached to this. And will I do it on audio? Will I do it on print? I don't know. But in the meantime, I'm not really hurting for space, so I'm totally fine holding on to it and seeing what happens. The next book that I brought into my library in December of 2020 was 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in This Strange World by Aleph Shafak. This had really been on my radar in the run-up to the Booker Prize announcement that year. It was on the shortlist, but it ultimately did not win. However, it is something I would still like to read. And I admit the urgency has kind of died down. Obviously, there's a lot of urgency when a book is up for a prize, and a lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of people are reading that shortlist. So in 2020, it felt pretty urgent, and it doesn't anymore. However, it is still a book that I would like to catch up to at some point, and I am totally fine holding on to it and keeping it in my library until I do. I don't think I would do this one on audio. I think I would prefer to do the print book at some point. I just need something to kick me in the pants and get me to do it. Because the thing is, when the urgency dies down on one thing, there are a lot of other things that feel urgent. Like right now, I'm catching up on books that I want to fit in before the end of this year, things that were released this year, things that have movie adaptations coming out and things like that. So, you know, there are other things going on right now, but I still do want to get to 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world at some point, in some unknown point in the future. Then I saw this copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn combined with a book called Maggie-Now by Betty Smith. And this was probably a bit of a mistake, because what was going on was I really wanted a copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I have never read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I want to read it. And I was keeping an eye out for editions of it at my local used bookstore. And when this came in, I was like, well, this is really cool. It's clearly a vintage, really attractive, older book. And even though I don't have immediate plans to read Maggie-Now, maybe if I read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, I'll get around to it. Well, I mean, it's a beautiful book, but it's not a copy of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn that I would really feel comfortable reading. I would feel like I was going to break this. I'm a little nervous just handling it right now, which is not a good sign. So if I were going to read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, I either need to find another copy of it, or I need to get it from the library, or I need to do it on audio, and I don't know when or if I would ever do Maggie-Now. So seemed like a great idea at the time. Not so much anymore. However, it is an attractive book, and I do still want to read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and I don't think I would get rid of it. We'll see. I'm going to hold on to it, and we're going to see what happens, because I still want to read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, but every time I look at this, I think to myself, why did I buy an edition of this book that I can't read? Because I would feel like I was about to damage it. So that part's not great. I do still want to read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and because this is such an attractive edition of it, I'll hold on to it. It does take up a lot of space in an area that frequently gets a little bit crowded, but it's fine. I'm going to hold on to it, and we're going to see what happens with that. So in December of 2020, I only brought 5 books into my library, and I only read one. That was The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. And I have only unhauled one, and it was The Office of Historical Corrections by Danielle Evans. So mixed results there. December of 2019 is the smallest book haul, and it's also the least successful. There are only 3 books. 2 of them are not here anymore. The first was Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. I ended up reading that for the BookTube Prize the following year, and I did not like it. So it's not here anymore. And then there was Long Bright River by Liz Moore. I ultimately got rid of it during that crunch for space. Not even, I think it didn't quite make it to the really massive crunch for space. But even before that, there were frequently times when I needed room and had to make some concessions. And although I have not read Long Bright River, I've heard very mixed things about it from people. There were some people who really just hated it and some people who liked it. And then Joel actually did start it on audio and didn't finish it because he wasn't too big on it. And that's the thing that really led me to unhaul Long Bright River by Liz Moore. The third one, I do still have a copy of, and it's the only one that I have partially read. Yes, partially. It's The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Now, here's the thing though. I would read this still it's just that I purchased this because I had this idea in my head in 2020 that I was going to do a sort of read outside your comfort zone challenge, and I was going to read a bunch of genres that I don't typically read and challenge myself to get outside of my comfort zone. That was the whole point. But I made that a very ambitious project to the point that it was extremely unwieldy and difficult. So by the end of the year, I was really crunched for space, had a lot of things that I still needed to cram in, and ultimately I just decided to let it go. And the linchpin of that decision was that I started The Left Hand of Darkness on audio and was just really not enjoying it. I think I got about halfway through, maybe not even halfway, and just bailed. I would try it again, because I think part of that visceral reaction I had to not liking this book, like, I think it was not quite what I was expecting. There were things that I found a little bit annoying about it. I also just don't really read a whole lot of sci-fi fantasy, but I think a lot of it was irritation on my part that I felt like I needed to read this before the end of the year when I had other things I wanted to go on. I was feeling stressed because I had too many other things I needed to try to cram in. So I just decided, you know what? I'm releasing myself from this obligation and this challenge that I have set for myself, and I'm going to put this book down. So at some point I will probably try again, but it will be way in the future, because I do hear a lot of really good or interesting things about The Left Hand of Darkness, and especially from the perspective that there are characters who can shift gender. The execution of it was not really what I had been led to expect based on the feedback from some of those people who mentioned that. But that's not the book's fault. And I'm not going to blame Ursula K. Le Guin for that. So of the 3 books that I brought into my library in December of 2019, I read 1.5. The one being Trick Mirror by Gio Tolentino, which I just absolutely did not like, and the half being Left Hand of Darkness, which might be a little bit generous, but it's easier to say half than like a quarter or anything like that. And I have unhauled 2 of the books, and I still have Left Hand of Darkness. Maybe I'll get around to it at some point. We'll see what happens. So, overall, in the last 4 Decembers, I brought 25 books into my library. I've only read 7.5, which is not great. And again, most of those 7 came from last year's book haul, which is really interesting. Usually, over time, I have more success with the older book hauls. But actually, let me... 5, 6, 7. Yeah, a 7.5 is correct. I just wanted to double check my own math. So, I mean, it's an interesting book haul revisit from that perspective, because again, usually I have not had much time to get to the more recent ones, and over time I've had more success with the older ones. But hey, you know, it's not a bad thing, and there are still some books in here that I would like to get to. Some I don't have plans to, some I'm really not sure if, because they're 2 books in one, and what that's going to mean for me. But all in all, I'm still happy with the books that I brought into my library over the last 4 Decembers. If you have thoughts about any of these books or recommendations based on my interest or disinterest in any of these, I would love to hear it in the comment section down below. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.